Good morning. I'm Tara Sonenshine, Executive Vice President here at the United States Institute of Peace, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's program on Africa. I see people are still streaming in, and it's wonderful to see a large crowd for this subject. The Institute has been working in Africa for many, many years, doing all kinds of activities related to conflict prevention, management, and resolution. We have been working to train peacekeepers, professionalize the military, build civil society, work on electoral violence prevention. We have worked hard on issues of religion and conflict, Somalia, Sudan, and really everywhere that conflict is. But we also know that there are some positive stories, and I hope we're going to hear some of the very positive developments today. My thanks to our senior staff on Africa, David Smock, Abby Williams, John Temin, and Dr. Raymond Gilpin. Dr. Gilpin is our chief peace economist and an expert on Africa, and following our keynote speaker and address, Ray Gilpin will be moderating a Q&A with our featured guest and with all of you, and we'll be doing that by cards. So if you have cards, there'll be an opportunity to get them to the aisles, and somebody will deliver them. We also have an online audience that I welcome to this program, and I think folks in an overflow space, so wherever you are, we're delighted to have you. Now, a word about our special speaker today. Ambassador Wendy Sherman was confirmed as Undersecretary for Political Affairs in September of last year. Since then, I and her other colleagues, friends, and probably family get to see very little of Ambassador Sherman because she is always on a plane. And she has been flying to about 17 countries in just a few months. And if you know anything about Ambassador Sherman, you know that when she does anything, it is with enormous passion and energy and policy wisdom. And she takes that now to every country she travels to. Recently, 5 African countries, and we'll hear more about that today. What I also want to say is I'm convinced that Wendy Sherman, there's about 3 or 4 of her. There is no way somebody could do all the things she does and all the accomplishments she has. So let me give you just a flavor of a few of those accomplishments and read some of these titles. Not that titles in Washington mean anything, but I actually am pleased to read some of these to you. Prior to this position, Undersecretary Sherman served as Vice Chair of the Albright-Stonebridge Group. She served from 1997 to 2001 as counselor for the State Department and special advisor to President Clinton, and policy coordinator and what I would say chief troubleshooter for the whole region during the period of North Korea and its nuclear issues. Oh, I forgot to mention Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs under Warren Christopher. Oh, I forgot to mention service on the U.S. Department of Defense Policy Board. I could continue with various commissions and boards like Oxfam, but if I do that, I'm going to cut into her time and her energy and her passion. Would you join me in welcoming Undersecretary Ambassador Wendy Sherman?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And it's really a pleasure to be here today and have an opportunity to share some perspectives about Africa's future, which were, of course, reinforced by the recent trip that I took and that I'll talk about. I want to thank Tara for her kind words of introduction, as well as the Institute for sponsoring and hosting this program. I also want to pay tribute to the person I consider my mentor at the Department of State when it comes to African affairs, and that's Ambassador Johnny Carson, the Assistant Secretary for the Africa Bureau, Ambassador Carson, whom I think you all know. I ask Johnny all kinds of, I'm sure, stupid questions and press him to continue all of his efforts and to go even further than he has. And he is forever patient with me, always makes me think like I have something useful to say, and is open always, even with his many years of experience and wisdom, to hearing new ideas and trying to chart whatever course will help Africa and Africans move forward in the future they want to determine for themselves. He is here today, I see, with Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Don Yanamoto, Russell Brooks, Richard Roth, and many of the other. I see Deborah Malik up there, many other folks in the Africa world over at the State Department. And I know they work with all of you in this audience on a regular basis because of a shared passion that we all have for what I think is really a decade of really terrific opportunity to come for Africa. Africa has changed substantially over the past decade. And it is, in my view, way past time to recognize the positive developments that are occurring and the enormous potential that they present for Africa, for the United States, and for the global community. Africa is a continent on the move and has begun to realize some of the economic gains that have eluded it in the past. 6 of the 10 fastest-growing countries in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. I think most people would find that an astonishing fact. The IMF predicts that over the next 5 years, sub-Saharan Africa, that number will reach 7 of the top 10. I visited 2 of those fastest-growing countries, Angola and Nigeria, as well as Zambia, Malawi, and Kenya. And it is clear that those dramatic changes that I spoke of are happening. As we look at Africa, it's important to both look at and look beyond the headlines, and I wanted to stop for a moment to note 2 very positive outcomes in what is sometimes a difficult space. Ambassador Carson will travel soon to be part of a delegation representing the United States at the inauguration of the new president of Senegal, President Sall. This was a peaceful transfer of democratic power, and I salute President Wade for accepting the election and stepping aside, and it's an important milestone for Africa. Similarly, although none of us were very excited about in essence, in quotes, junta in Mali, and see this as a setback for a long tradition of democracy in Mali, we are also incredibly heartened by ECOWAS's efforts to mediate and to move back to democracy in Mali and support the people of Mali to do so and do so quickly. Again, a real statement about the growing strength of regional institutions in Africa and their ability to help lead Africa to the future that Africans want. Prior to returning to government service this last year, as Tara noted, I spent a decade in the private sector. And among other things, I was on an investment committee of an emerging markets fund that looked at investment opportunities around the world, and I can tell you that Africa was very much on the front burner in that regard. My recent trip and that past experience have convinced me that Africa is in a period of rapid economic transformation. Africa is now closer than ever to really creating self-sustaining growth. For many years, we devoted our efforts, and all of you in this room did, and we still are, to resolving conflicts, improving health outcomes, establishing responsible civilian democracies, to create a foundation for the developments that we are now seeing. Real economic growth, the fruit of our longstanding investment in Africa, which promises to lift millions, literally millions, out of poverty and foster long-term stability, is happening in large and small countries across the continent. The facts support this assessment. Africa has the highest rate of return on foreign direct investment of any developing region, with returns of U.S. investors hovering around 29% since 1990. In the next 8 years, the consumer, resource, agricultural, and infrastructure sectors could be worth an estimated $2.6 trillion in annual revenue. By 2020, the largest sub-Saharan African markets, Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Lagos, will each hit $25 billion a year in household spending. We are seeing the development of the next big economic frontier, and the United States has much to gain and much to offer by recognizing and supporting Africa's just and sustainable economic growth. We have much in common with the people of Africa and a great deal of relevant expertise to share. For example, agriculture is one of Africa's most promising sectors. Approximately 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land is on the African continent, covering over 600 million hectares, an area roughly the size of the Dominican Republic of the Congo. And no one knows agriculture better than Americans. Working together with African partners to provide profitable and sustainable agriculture is a natural for the United States. Production of natural resources on the continent, principally oil, gas, and minerals, is also likely to continue its steady growth of between 2% and 4% annually, raising the value of resource production to $540 billion in the next 8 years. New technologies are creating 21st century opportunities for Africa. For instance, as many of you know, mobile phones and their applications are revolutionizing lives on the continent. In the past decade alone, we have seen approximately 500 million new phone subscribers in Africa, mobile phone subscribers, which has helped Africa to forego the installation of costly landlines and helped to introduce banking services where none previously existed. These technologies are also being used in innovative ways that, quite frankly, we have yet to see happen here, particularly by Africa's younger generation, to monitor elections, help prevent violence in places like Eastern Congo, and to share market data to ensure farmers get the best prices for their goods. Connecting rural areas to urban centers and Africa to the rest of the world, new technologies have helped raise awareness throughout the continent and are helping to reshape the basis of societies. Sustaining economic growth over the long term will, of course, not be easy, and it will take an integrated approach that must include the establishment of very basic and very fundamental good governance and strong democratic institutions. Vibrant institutions are absolutely essential, as President Obama said in his eloquent speech in Accra in July 2009. Development depends on good governance. That is the ingredient which has been missing in far too many places around Africa, President Obama said. And that is the ingredient that pulls everything together, that provides order, structure, and a reliable legal framework in which economies can grow. Good governance and the rule of law protect individual human rights as well as corporations and contract rights. Good governance can root out corruption and will protect the rights of labor as well as intellectual property. Secure environment, sustainable poverty reduction, better infrastructure, transparency, accountability, vibrant civil societies, and effective and accountable security forces are also elements essential for success. The United States understands these realities, and we are working very hard with our African partners to help define, initiate, and establish the necessary reforms and policies to accommodate local values and local culture while acknowledging international standards for increased growth and investment. In significant measure, Africa is developing stronger government institutions capable of delivering vital services, effective legislative institutions capable of providing oversight, and responsible judiciaries committed to upholding the rule of law. These developments, although we have a ways to go yet, offer great promise for the future. Strong, vibrant societies are a critical element of a democratic framework. Civil society plays a critical role by holding African governments and elected officials accountable. In most of the countries I visited, I met with representatives from across civil society, including human rights advocates, religious leaders, women's groups, and more, who are dedicated to rooting out corruption and promoting transparency and ensuring their governments follow through on promised reforms. Due to the demographic realities facing Africa, where 1 in 5 of the planet's young people will reside by 2040, 1 out of every 5 will reside in Africa. Youth will play, and already do, an increasingly important role in these societies. I was struck, as I'm sure you are, for example, that 43% of the entire population of Angola is under 14 years of age. 43% under the age of 14. We've also seen how civil society organizations can advocate and press for change on behalf of marginalized communities. For instance, during my trip to the continent, I had the opportunity to hold discussions with several women's advocacy groups. I happened to be there on International Women's Day, which I celebrated the day before, the day of, the day after, all of whom are dedicated to securing greater human rights and economic opportunities for women. I also saw many encouraging signs of Africa's political changes. In Kenya, I witnessed firsthand the importance citizens are attaching to good governance. As all of you know, just over 4 years ago, Kenya experienced horrific political violence in the wake of its 2007 election, threatening to push one of Africa's most promising democracies and a regional economic powerhouse over the brink. But the Kenyan people joined together to reject the politics that were dividing their country, and in 2010 voted to approve a new constitution that brings with it the promise for a new era of accountable and truly democratic governance. And although all of the Kenyans I met understand the difficult challenges they have in this process, everywhere else I went on the continent talked about how they wanted what Kenya had. In Nigeria, a country with a dynamic civil society, I was deeply impressed by conversations with parliamentarians, social activists, business people, and clergymen, among others, who were actively debating the challenges facing Nigerian society, from the threat of Boko Haram and the economic neglect of northern communities to the recent presidential election and management of the oil sector. Even with the problems facing them, and they are daunting, there are powerful forces that bind Nigerians together, and the passion and commitment I saw among the people with whom I met will and can help address the challenges ahead. So, what are some of the steps needed to consolidate and further the continent's growth? One critical component of Africa's long-term growth will be increased regional integration. According to the African Development Bank, intra-Africa exports represent a paltry 9.6% of the region's total exports, compared to 20% for Latin America and 48% for developing Asia. Regional trade can boost the continent's industries by creating economies of scale, establish and strengthen product value chains, and facilitate the transfer of technology and knowledge via spillover effects. Such activities can promote infrastructure development and attract foreign direct investment. I saw that this is particularly true in southern Africa, where the strength of the South African economy, coupled with the natural resources of neighboring states such as Zambia, Angola, and even Malawi, could unleash enormous economic activity. If these markets were linked by regional road, rail, port, and energy infrastructure, in addition to liberal regulatory regimes to facilitate the free movement of goods and services throughout the subregion. To paraphrase what Secretary Clinton said in her speech to the African Union last year, it's not sufficient to only focus on development work. As she said, in the past, our development work, quote, provided only temporary aid and not the foundation for lasting change that helps permanently people improve their lives and communities. But the Obama administration, she said, is taking a different approach. Our goal is to help countries' economies grow over time so that they can meet their own needs. Ultimately, we believe that the most effective development programs are the ones that put themselves out of business because they spark economic activity, they help create strong institutions, they nourish a private sector that, unleashed, will create more jobs. And that is why we also need a dynamic private sector that will equally contribute to realizing Africa's economic potential. No one should doubt Africa's abilities in that area. there are approximately 20 African companies with revenues of at least $3 billion. And in 2010, consumer spending in sub-Saharan Africa equaled nearly $600 billion, accounting for almost 8% of all emerging market spending. Africa also has enormous intellectual capital that is on the verge of being unleashed. I witnessed firsthand the drive for innovation and entrepreneurship on the continent when I visited the iHub in Nairobi, where members of the Kenyan tech community, most of them considerably younger than me, and entrepreneurs are coming together to develop new technologies and products for consumers in Africa and beyond. In support of this trend, the State Department joined with software developers to launch our Apps for Africa program to address local challenges like climate change, good governance, health, and education through the use of innovative mobile technologies. Another important element is, of course, economic diversification, a key to sustained economic growth in Africa. We've seen far too many cases where countries focus on a handful of commodities with minimal job creation and spillover outside that sector. To take full advantage of the continent's natural resources, which are plentiful, countries need to encourage fiscal transparency, responsible use of revenue for economic development, including spending on education, health, and infrastructure, and development of laws and regulations which facilitate creation of new businesses. I was pleased, for example, to hear from senior Angolan officials of their desire and intention to diversify their economy beyond the petroleum sector, which has brought much wealth to Angola, but which has yet to significantly improve the economic circumstances of the average Angolan. The United States recognizes both the opportunities and constraints, and we are fully committed to assisting our African partners as they work to put in place holistic approaches to achieve greater economic strength, economic growth, and bring about a peaceful and prosperous Africa. We're implementing a host of programs of which I think you're familiar, but I want to highlight just a few very quickly. One of the most important new initiatives is the Feed the Future program, which is currently active in 12 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Through Feed the Future, the U.S. government is renewing its commitment to agriculture as a vehicle for sustainably reducing hunger and poverty, a prerequisite for sustained economic growth. Feed the Future harnesses the power of the private sector and research to transform agricultural development in sectors with high potential to increase incomes among smallholder farmers, especially women farmers that traditionally have fewer resources. In Malawi, I visited Bunda Agricultural College, where that country's next generation of agricultural experts are no longer being trained in the United States, they are being trained in Malawi. Built in large measure with USAID funding over 40 years ago, Bunda College is not just training its students in the fundamentals of farming. They are learning the dynamics of international agribusiness, skills they will need to make Malawi's agricultural sector competitive in the 21st century. The Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, of course, remains the centerpiece of our economic and commercial partnership with Africa. AGOA promotes free markets, expands U.S.-African trade and investment, stimulates economic growth, and facilitates sub-Saharan integration into the global economy. AGOA currently provides 40 countries with duty-free access for 6,000 diverse product lines. Since its enactment in 2000, two-way trade has grown to $82.1 billion in 2010, and AGOA exports to the United States have increased to $44.3 billion. This year's AGOA Forum in Washington, scheduled for June, will focus on improving the provision of infrastructure as a critical requirement for a growing trade relationship. We will then host a follow-on business conference in Cincinnati that will continue these themes in the context of concrete activities aimed at facilitating trade. We expect robust participation from the U.S. and African private sectors, as well as government officials, to underscore the priority of addressing Africa's infrastructure and energy needs. Through the African Women's Entrepreneurship Program, or AWEP, we only use acronyms, of course, we are working directly with African entrepreneurs to accelerate the growth of women-oriented businesses and export capacity, foster leadership for women's business organizations, and support women's advocacy roles as voices of change in their communities. Across Africa, an increasing percentage of businesses are being started and run by women. And those businesses are growing as a measurable force in the world economy. I can tell you, as the former chair of Oxfam America's board, we are all about entrepreneurship in Africa, from the beginning of microfinance in saving for change programs in small neighborhoods to boutique entrepreneur businesses by women. It's quite extraordinary what's happening in the world. To quote current World Bank President Robert Zoellick, quote, giving women greater earning power and greater control over resources within their households could boost children's health, could increase children's education and girls' education, could leverage entrepreneurship and economic productivity, and could take us closer to that world beyond aid. The United States is committed to this vision by bringing leading African women entrepreneurs together through AWEP. Let me say that in my many years as a diplomat, advocate, and businesswoman, I have met with many, many women's groups and have been part of many myself. But I have never seen the level of dynamism, passion, and courage that I saw in the women's groups on this trip. Just as we're working to empower women entrepreneurs through AWEP, we are also launching initiatives designed to engage directly with African youth, who, as I noted, make up an increasingly large portion of the continent's population. 2 out of 3 Africans are under 30 years of age, and an average of 10 million Africans enter the job market each year, and so robust engagement with the youth sector is critical. This is an effort in which both the President and the First Lady have been personally involved. Both have hosted forums with Africa's young leaders, the President in Washington in 2010 and the First Lady in South Africa a year later. The U.S. government is working to develop initiatives to support and engage with Africa's young leaders. In support of these efforts, the State Department intends to launch a U.S. public-private mentoring partnership for young African leaders, which is meant to be a mentorship and networking program created to partner 75 young African entrepreneurs with U.S. business professionals to foster innovation, corporate investment, and corporate social responsibility activities in Africa. At a speech I gave at the University of Zambia, I was deeply impressed by the intelligence, worldliness, and vitality of the student body. Indeed, a young man, probably about 20, delivered to me the same Marxist ideology about the world that I spouted when I was his age in college. They questioned me about American foreign policy and expressed both hope and concern about Zambia's future. Judging by their level of sophistication, I'm certain that the future of Zambia will be in very good and rigorous hands. It is also worth noting that 2 of the 4 Partnerships for Growth countries are in sub-Saharan Africa. Rooted in the President's 2010 Policy Directive on Global Development, we are partnering with both Tanzania and Ghana through this initiative to address the constraints and barriers to growth and developing plans of action to address these. Through this partnership, we hope to expand both countries' access to international markets, promote flows of domestic and foreign investment, and improve the effectiveness, transparency, and accountability of both countries' public institutions. As all of these initiatives illustrate, Secretary Clinton has placed economic diplomacy at the center of U.S. foreign policy. Some of you might have been wondering, why is the Undersecretary for Political Affairs giving a speech about economics? But it is, in fact, at the heart of the future of not only of Africa, but of the world, of our own country, for that matter, as we all know as citizens here. We are actively promoting our economic statecraft agenda throughout the world by attracting U.S. companies to invest in Africa's agriculture, infrastructure, and energy sectors. In our diplomatic push to link business interests to development, we're working to see concrete deals made which spur economic growth and job creation in Africa and the United States. We, of course, understand that health is a critical issue for sustained economic growth and long-term economic stability as well. And as you all know, as part of our holistic approach, the Obama administration launched the Global Health Initiative, which commits U.S. support to fight disease and improve health systems so that people can actually live lives. We're improving the health of women, newborns, and children in the areas of infectious disease, nutrition, safe water, maternal and child health. building on PEPFAR, the President's Malaria Initiative, and neglected tropical disease programs. I think that you all know what an extraordinary amount of work has been done. I saw this work firsthand at Bwala Hospital in Malawi, where officials from USAID and the Center for Disease Control are working hand in hand to prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV, ensure access to adequate prenatal care, provide basic pediatric services to some 200 mothers and children each day. Finally, as I come close to the end of this long speech, sustained growth requires peace and security. The last element of this holistic approach I want to highlight is effective and accountable security services. Political tension, you've seen more today in Sudan, conflict and violence stifle the continent's ability to develop a vibrant economy, destroying export infrastructure and slowing or even reversing regional integration. African militaries and security forces have played both a positive and sometimes negative role in the development of government institutions. In West Africa, African peacekeepers contributed importantly to the rebuilding of the war-torn countries of Liberia and Sierra Leone. But as we have just seen recently in Mali, militaries can threaten decades of democratic gains. That is why a critical component of our engagement with Africa is to help African countries develop professional militaries to provide for the national defense of sovereign states and the safety of the people while respecting civilian authority. Likewise, we support the creation of effective coast guards and maritime security forces to enforce exclusive economic zones and cut down on illegal fishing, as well as professional border security forces to cut down on illicit trafficking. I've spent much of this time discussing Africa's immense potential and how we're helping our partners on the continent to harness it. However, I and you fully recognize the significant challenges that remain to be overcome. We remain focused on finding a long-lasting solution to the ongoing dispute between Sudan and South Sudan. Likewise, the conflict and instability in Somalia remains unresolved. Nevertheless, the transitional federal government with whom I met in Nairobi and the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM, are making significant strides in the fight against al-Shabaab. Political gains have been more difficult to achieve, and the Somali people continue to bear the brunt of the violence. And unfortunately, Somalia continues to be a source of regional and global instability. During my visit to Kenya, I traveled to the Dadaab refugee camp in northern Kenya. It is now equivalent to the fourth largest city in Kenya. Meeting a 20-year-old refugee who was born in the camp and has never had an opportunity to leave or lead any other kind of life was a stark reminder for me of the human toll of ongoing conflict in Somalia. My visit to Nigeria underscored the serious issues and insecurity confronting this regional powerhouse, including the problem of Boko Haram in northern Nigeria and criminal groups in the Niger Delta. In northern Nigeria, it's critical that the government address the social and economic disparities that have contributed to the crisis. Many of the challenges facing the continent know no borders. Despite our best efforts through Feed the Future and other programs, food insecurity remains widespread across the continent, and the effects of climate change risk undercutting the tremendous progress we have made on this front. All one has to do is look at the top of Mount Kilimanjaro to see how much the snow cover there has been reduced in recent years, to see that climate change is having a significant impact. Weak infrastructure is another major challenge, even though African governments and private sources combined are investing about $72 billion a year in new infrastructure. The lack of sufficient power, water, and transportation infrastructure still seriously impedes growth. Despite our realistic assessment of the scale of these challenges, I remain hopeful, optimistic, and confident that if we pursue a holistic approach to encourage economic growth and stronger democratic institutions, we can contribute substantially as partners for Africa to harness its full potential and become a stronger and more effective member of the international community. There is no doubt a difficult road remains ahead, but if we can look beyond some of the bad headlines to what is really happening on the ground, we will recognize the signs of economic growth and emerging democratic institutions that bode well for Africa's future. I thank you all for what you do every day to help realize with the African people this hope for the future, and I look forward to continuing this discussion with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Undersecretary, for those very insightful comments. I see you had a very fruitful and hands-on trip across the continent. We have a few minutes for questions. If you do have questions, I'll encourage you to write them on your cards and pass them down to the end of the either side, either aisle, and they'll make their way to the front. Madam Undersecretary, you rightly talked about the transitions that are happening in Africa at the moment, particularly the economic transitions and the political transitions, and the remarkable story of sustained growth over the last decade. Part of the challenge is translating that growth into projects, activities that make a difference in the lives of the individual African citizen. In your view and from your trip, do you see evidence of that happening? And what could be done to accelerate that so that the growth is not just self-sustaining, but is also conflict sensitive?
Very important point, and actually was really what I was trying to say in the speech, which is all of the pieces that are necessary to support Africans as they try to create that sustainable economic growth. That is having strong democratic institutions, so all of the programs that we not only engage in as a government, but civil society here in the United States partners with Africans in Africa to do to help ensure constitutional reform, judicial systems, other democratic reforms that create institutions that are going to hold governments accountable to make sure that money is spent well, that it reaches people, that it helps the average citizen, it doesn't just end up in the pockets of an elite. And I think the best evidence of that was the vibrancy of the civil society that I saw in all these countries. It is crucial to support those voices on the ground. And I think one of the concerns that I didn't address in this speech that I think we all have to be mindful of, not only in Africa but throughout the world, is that there is a bit of an assault on non-governmental organizations these days, particularly non-governmental organizations that are supported by people all over the world. And I think it's very crucial that we all stand up for those organizations, particularly sometimes when they speak ill of governments. We don't like it in this country when NGOs speak ill of the Obama administration, Secretary Clinton, of course. I don't like getting that criticism, but it's part of a democratic society that creates mechanisms of accountability and ensures that growth really comes to all of the citizens of a country. So I think our support for those strong civil society voices is a crucial piece. I also think private sector engagement is quite crucial. I think there's more and more private sector engagement with Africa. I would encourage everybody in this room to help companies to see the potential that is there, to find support and help so they have a good guide to doing business in Africa. But there's tremendous potential. And that youth population, I have said many places, this is going to be where the labor force of the next couple of decades is going to be because the labor force in other parts of the world will be too expensive.
Absolutely. The importance of support from partners like the United States is very crucial. The issues facing most African countries require attention to good governance, economics, politics. Traditionally, we think about the 3Ds, defense, diplomacy, and development. When you think about that in the context of Africa and from a U.S. perspective, are you thinking about 3 institutions, state, USAID, and DoD, or are you thinking about 3 concepts that each of these institutions should embrace as they engage African countries?
Well, I think you've put it well in some ways, though I don't think they're separable. I think it's concepts, because this is about not the United States, though I try to do a job that meets United States interests. But in terms of creating the sustainable economic growth that you're mentioning, this is about what Africans are going to do. And so Africans, as I said, have to and are working to make sure they have democratic institutions. And I think the actions by ECOWAS over the last few days show how important democratic institutions are to Africans themselves. This is an African-led effort to put democracy back in the center of Mali. Defense ministers are there today, to your point, to say to the junta, you have to move aside, we have to go back to barracks, we have to put civil authority back in position. So we have the defense mechanism of ECOWAS speaking to the military in Mali to move back to a civilian authority and to a constitutional process. We have the presidents of the countries of ECOWAS coming tomorrow to deliver a similar message about what the future ought to look like and move back to constitutional processes. And you have conversations from us and from other international donors about what development needs are necessary. So you have diplomacy, defense, and development playing out in front of us as an African-led effort to ensure that Mali has a great democratic future as it has had democracy for the last 2 decades.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions about the other part of the continent, Somalia. You mentioned Somalia twice in your remarks. The questioners want to know specifically what sort of support the United States could provide by way of a balanced 3Ds approach in Somalia, not just to address the current crisis, but also to ensure that there is both predictability in terms of governance and also openness in terms of economic outcomes.
Well, one of the things that we've tried to be very focused on is ensuring that while we support Somalis and AMISOM to create a more secure environment, that we also ensure there's going to be a political process so that once one has that secure environment, there's actually a governance structure to help Somalia move forward. Because if you just get a secure environment but there's no governance structure, then you're going to have backsliding pretty quickly because there will be no way to ensure the sustainability of that security, no way to return to a country, in essence. So when I was in Nairobi, I met with the Prime Minister of the TFG and with some of his advisors, with Ambassador Swan, who, if you all have not met him, is just spectacular, to talk about where they were on the roadmap to all of the changes that had to be put in place, all of the agreements that were made for benchmarks to be reached by August, to see where the Prime Minister and his team were on meeting those benchmarks. He assured me, and we went through in great detail, what he's doing to reach that, not because we're asking for it, not because the international community is asking for it, though it's good to have that pressure, but because he knows that's what must happen to ensure governance for Somalia in the long term. That's a crucial, if not altogether sufficient step to get to that political governance structure. So the United States does what we can to provide with the international community and of course with the African Union, which has been quite crucial to what's happening, and the UN, to what's happening in Somalia, to put together the pieces of a secure environment, the military piece of this, to put together the governance piece of it, and then of course development will be crucial because Somalia will need to have an economic future. And the people of Somalia will need to know that they can once again live. It is heartbreaking to meet with refugees at Dadaab. And because there is in essence now, in effect, an insurgency inside of the refugee camp, it is not a secure environment. I was not free to walk among the refugees. I met with folks at the compound, the people who are delivering services at the refugee camp now have to operate in a somewhat different fashion. Hopefully this will be short-lived as we work through the issues. But to meet, I use that 20-year-old as emblematic, but it is story after story of this is my life. Hundreds of thousands of people living in a partly tent city still that is a refugee camp, wondering whether they will ever get to live a life that you and I take for granted every single day.
Yeah, thank you. The late last year, USIP hosted a joint State Department USAID initiative which brought public-private alliance together to work towards ending the trade in conflict minerals in Central Africa. And you talked about the importance of this not just being a public sector effort, but also engaging the private sector, private investment. And you alluded to ways in which the United States could encourage more private investment in Africa. Could you expand on this a little bit and give us your thoughts on what most people see as the Chinese expansion across the continent? You probably knew you were going to get that one.
Yeah, sure, of course. One thing about the Chinese expansion, everybody talks about it as if it's brand new. It is not brand new. It has existed in Africa for quite a long time. We have a basic approach. I get asked this question a lot on Africa, and I get this question a lot when I talk about Latin America as well. And that is, doesn't the United States think it's a bad thing that there's Chinese investment? And we don't, in the sense that if China invests in Africa through a rules-based system where China plays by the rules of the rules-based international financial and economic system, it is good for Africa because it is investment, it creates jobs. The United States can compete against that as well as anybody else. It creates markets for our goods. It creates exports that become part of the international system. It creates a middle class that's also good for the United States because we have a lot we want to sell to that middle class, and the president is moving an export strategy. So it is a good thing. Where it is a problem is where anyone does not play by those rules-based systems so that it becomes unfair competition. And that is where the concern is. It is good for anyone to invest in Africa if it is rules-based, if it acknowledges the role of the private sector, good governance, civil society, anti-corrupt, all of these things, has transparency. This is good for Africans, and it's then good for the United States.
And what practical steps could be taken to engage the private sector?
Well, I think the initiative you've taken around conflict minerals, and that has taken place around the world around conflict minerals and around transparency initiatives, are all quite critical because it's part of creating a system that is transparent, a system that is accountable, a system that does not end up with child labor, bad labor practices, corruption, bad business practices, all of these things which create an unstable and unsustainable economic market. So those kind of initiatives are quite crucial. Sharing that expertise, getting businesses to agree as coalitions to adopt those principles, and I think everything from the UN Social Compact to EITI are all mechanisms to create accountability and rules-based systems for doing business in Africa. At the same time, I think we probably spend too little time also focused on African entrepreneurs. And the Secretary has been very focused on making sure that we raise up African entrepreneurs. The mentoring program that I talked about to help folks build to scale to small and medium enterprise in Africa is not what we mean by small and medium enterprise. So let's try to move them up that scale to being small and medium enterprise. These young folks that are running the iHub in Nairobi are cutting edge, very exciting things going on. The mobile technology that I spoke of, we can learn some things from. So I think anything we can do to also focus on the entrepreneurship in Africa and mentoring with international corporations to help raise them up is a useful enterprise.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions, but we have a few here that border on the issue of interagency coordination. Last November...
We do that perfectly.
Yes. Last November in Busan, there was talk about harmonization. And the issue becomes, given that we have over 20 different U.S. agencies involved in both development and commerce as it relates to the African continent, could you just give us your thoughts on how we could streamline this so it becomes a lot more manageable for the African countries and so that they could, get the most out of this U.S. assistance and support?
Sure. You've probably heard of the QDDR, I'll bet. I
have indeed. And USIP was part of the discussion and preparation as the QDDR moved ahead.
Absolutely. What I'm referring to is the quadrennial diplomacy and development review that Secretary Clinton undertook to really address this question. And it takes me back to an Aspen Strategy Group meeting of some years ago when we were looking we knew there would be a transition of government of some sort. And we spent a lot of time talking about development and diplomacy. And Gail Smith, who's now, of course, in the White House, did a mapping of all of the agencies involved in foreign assistance and talk about a spaghetti mess. It was an extraordinary, you should ask her sometime to share the pictograph with you. It was overwhelming to say the least. But the point of the QDDR was to, in fact, bring a whole of government effort to what we are doing. And the Secretary has created a number of mechanisms to try to do that. I don't want to elaborate them all here today, but rather to say we understand this dilemma and we understand this process. So rather than say that the Department of Health has to stop doing what they're doing, we want to harness it. We want to bring it into the overall strategy of what we're doing. We have strengthened the role of chiefs of mission on the ground so that the chiefs of mission are really the chief executive officer who is using all of the skills of all of the people who are part of that embassy. Only 30% or less are State Department employees. The rest of them are everybody else's employees. But to harness that in a chief of mission, CEO approach to ensure that we capture all of those different talents, all that expertise, so that in the 3Ds that you elaborated, we are using all of that talent, we are bringing it all to bear in a way that is useful for the government with which we're interacting, and quite frankly, not just for the government. One of the other things that's happened, I've been away from the Department of State for a decade, and people ask me about what the changes have been, and of course I always answer the biggest change are the use of BlackBerries. I lived back in the age where we thought pagers were exciting. So that's changed how we do work and how we do diplomacy. We're not quite up to what Africans do with mobile phones, but we're making progress. So the other thing that has changed is that we all know that it is not enough to just talk with governments. Ambassadors talk with people in the street. They talk with shopkeepers. They talk with civil society. They talk with opposition. They talk with youth leaders. They talk with women leaders. That you don't know what's going on in a society. You don't have fingertips. You can't understand the ways to help unless you're talking to everybody. And that's changed remarkably. We always did some of it, but not the way we are now.
Thank you. Just one brief question.
Sure.
You didn't mention the word corruption in your speech. Was that intentional or just... Because generally discussions...
I think I did.
You did?
I think once. What was intentional about the speech was to focus on the opportunities, the positive trajectory, the good things that are going on in Africa, the opportunities that are in Africa. But the speech didn't leave out the challenges because they are real and they are present every single day. But we are too focused, and understandably so at some level, on the pain, the agony, the headlines, the conflict, the corruption. That it exists in every developing society and even exists in developed societies. We are not corruption-free in the United States of America. So it was to focus on the positives, not to ignore the work that needs to be done, but to put it in a larger frame. Because if we only focus on the challenges, we miss the opportunities, and we miss how the opportunities are really the path to dealing with those challenges. You can't deal with corruption if people have no hope, if people believe they have no economic opportunity, if they believe there's no way for them to earn $1 except to take it in bad ways. And so that's why this speech headed in a different direction. It's the direction in which Africa is headed.
Thank you very much, and I think that's a really excellent juncture at which to bring this to a close. Thank you so much, Madam Undersecretary, for being so generous with your time and your insights. Thank you to the audience, and before I leave, I'd just like to make a quick plug and thank, in particular, Tara Nesvanderani for all her hard work behind the scenes, and I think I'll hand it over to you, Tara.
Well, I hope you'll all join me in thanking Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman for today's presentation. It was a very foundational speech, and I hope for all of you it widened the aperture on the continent and took us from a very singular country-by-country approach to a real continent-wide view. And so if all of you would join me in a round of applause, and we will let the Undersecretary go.